Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The Association of Italian Canadian Writers is pleased to present the Alexis Story and Others. Emma Pivato reads from her work. I'm Maria Pia Spadafora, and I'm pleased to introduce Emma Pivato. Emma Pivato is a retired psychologist and academic who has published 8 novels in her Claire Bourke mystery series. This September, her new book, And Along Came Alexis, was released by Guernica Editions. It is the story of family life with her 43-year-old daughter, Alexis, who was born with severe physical and intellectual challenges. Emma will read from And Along Came Alexis and end her reading with some short passage from 2 mystery novels. Please remain muted during the readings. At the end of the readings, we will have a period for questions and answers. Thank you. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the Association of the Italian Canadian Writers and their president, Licia Canton, for sponsoring this reading. And I would also like to give a very special thank you to Maria Pia Spadafora for all her assistance in pulling it together and for hosting this event. Even more so because it is now 11 p.m. in Milano, Italy, where she is situated. Our younger daughter, Alexis, will be 44 years come January. And during her lifetime, the language used by advocates to describe people in her situation has undergone many changes. When Alexis was born in 1978, the term mental retardation was still in common use, but was soon replaced by developmental disability and then mental handicap. Then by the late 80s or the 90s, people like Alexis were no longer said to be anything, but rather to have challenges. Golfers have challenges. What Alexis has are massive life-limiting roadblocks. But after a while, even challenge as a term fell into disuse. I was next told that Alexis and her peers are not disabled at all. They are merely differently able. I have no patience with any of this word parsing. If, like Alexis, you cannot see, cannot use your hands or legs, cannot talk or chew, and are barely able to eat purees or drink without aspirating, and you also have life-threatening seizures, then you are not able in any meaningful sense of the word. And unlike the people attacking Mount Everest, you are not challenged. You are, in fact, for all intents and purposes, defeated before you even begin. So, why did Joe and I even bother trying to help someone like Alexis? Compassion, pity, martyrly duty? Not at all. Once we escaped the language flurry and the misguided attempts to categorize our daughter, and we really got to know her, we saw other things. We saw that Alexis was in a prison with no way out. The best we could do for her was to work towards some form of day parole. However, she made no progress in any of the usual developmental areas, like sitting up, holding an object, or using language. There was only one exception, that most mundane, menial, and unmentionable of all tasks, proper toilet etiquette. For some reason, Alexis quickly developed an understanding of what was expected of her in that area. She was praised accordingly, and she felt her success. And it was through her success in that area that we learned to communicate with her after a fashion, and she learned to trust. She learned that people cared about her and that she counted. She learned she was safe. She learned that she had rights, including the right not to be ignored and neglected and not to be left bored and idle. She also learned that she had responsibilities to try the best she could in the tiny realm over which she had some control. And she learned that if she did not try, we would not be happy with her. In other words, she developed a sense of social responsibility. Joe is my life partner, but Alexis is my business partner. Together, we have accomplished various things in the Alice in Wonderland world we fell into because of her many disabilities. This book is a history of the failures and accomplishments we have experienced together along the way. And now I will share a few vignettes for you to illustrate this experience. I'm going to start with, okay, we're showing pictures now of Alexis. This is Alexis listening to our son's daughter, Layla, our granddaughter, play jazz piano, which she's very good at. Alexis loves music, and she particularly enjoyed listening to Layla play jazz. And that's her happy look when she's very, very pleased with something. Okay. This is Alexis 2 days ago, coming in from a walk in the rain. She loves to go walking in the rain. You see, she's in her special cart there, which means we can take her walking 12 months a year. We can take her on mountain trails. We can take her along ruts and valleys because the cart has big wheels. And she enjoys being outside a lot. And this is Alexis 2 years ago, I think, at the Blue Chair Cafe in Edmonton here, listening to a live music. I believe it was a folk music, can't remember. Anyway, she always enjoys music, and she particularly enjoys live music. She definitely appreciates the difference between that and music on CDs, etc. Okay, so that gives you an idea of who Alexis is. But believe me, she didn't start out that way. It took many years and a lot of hard work. It took, for example, I'm going to say this, 8 years for her to keep her eyes open. She is blind, cortically blind, but we did a lot of intensive eye exercises with her when she was young, eye stimulation. And as I said, it took 8 years. She still closes them in the evenings when she's tired. Sometimes she has them closed all the way through supper. So there's that. All right, I'm going to start my readings with a story called, I'm calling it The Sled Story. Alexis and the Ski Hill. Our son Marcus was almost 4 when his youngest sister Alexis was born, and 18 months later he started grade 1 at a private school a fair distance from our home. It ended at 12:30 each day, so my husband Joe drove him there in the morning on his way to work, and I bundled Alexis and her older sister Juliana into the car at lunchtime and picked them up. On the road to the school, we passed a ski hill, and many days I looked at it longingly. As we passed it day after day, I wondered if there was a way to regain that giddy sense of freedom that I had felt soaring down a hill in the days when I skied. One day, I drove up to the hill and stopped. I got the children out and we walked to the top. The conditions were perfect. They wanted to just slide down on their backs, and I did not stop them. I even slid down myself in my leather coat. It provided a slippery surface, but the experience left permanent marks on it. After that, we stopped periodically at the hill on the way home from Marcus's school. I bought the older children a plastic fold-up sheet toboggan, and they soared down the hill together on it while Alexis and I watched from the top. But I wanted her to have that experience too. It was March, and we were having an early melt. The snow cover on the hill would not be there much longer. I should mention that Alexis would have been about 2 years and 2 months old at that point. When we moved into our new home in Windsor Park, we discovered that the previous owner had left behind a one-person Arctic pack sled. It was like an ordinary sled, but with steel runners and high steel side rails. In those days, the Glenrose Hospital orthotics and prosthetics technicians still crafted trunk supports to hold children unable to sit up independently, to hold them securely in their wheelchairs or in their car seats. When Alexis was about 1 year old, Joe brought out the sled from our garage one day and figured out a way to attach the trunk support directly to it. That way I could go for walks with Alexis in the winter by pulling her on the sled. Whenever the children and I visited the ski hill, I always pulled Alexis along in the sled in this manner. On this particular day, with the sun shining and the snow melting, I felt compelled to have Alexis experience the sense of freedom and joy her brother and sister were feeling, sliding up and down that hill. There was a small amount of room for one person to kneel on the sled behind the trunk support, but it was not enough room for me, so Marcus was designated. I positioned the sled at the top of the hill and he got on the back. I talked to him seriously about how he had to steer it and how careful he had to be with Alexis sitting in front, unable to protect herself. And he understood the responsibility being placed upon him. Life is never simple, and Juliana took that moment to object vehemently to being left behind and to question why her brother had been chosen over her to guide the sled. My grip must have loosened slightly as I turned to reason with her, and the force of gravity on the slippery, melting snow jerked the sled out of my hands. The sudden jolt caused Marcus to fall off backwards, and Alexis went careening down the hill alone. The three of us tore after her, but there was no hope of catching up. The sled moved swiftly and surely, like it had a mind of its own. Near the bottom of the hill, it slewed to the left, heading down a lower hill next to the ski building. There was a large plate glass window on the facing wall, and the people inside the building stared out in horror at this tiny child speeding towards them on a collision course. A steep cut bank next to the window had been carved out by the melting snow, and the sled nosed down and collided with the base of the window. But Alexis, securely strapped in her trunk support, never moved. And one person there told me later that when the sled hit the building, she had an excited smile on her face. I retrieved Alexis, explained our actions as best I could to that sea of judgmental faces, and we all went home. Alexis napped longer than usual that afternoon, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that I had managed to share with her one of the key experiences in my life, that wonderful free sense of soaring down a hill. This story, we tried many things when and I should say when I use the word our, I'm talking about a group of mothers, some of whom are on the site today. Hello, Kathy, Mary Jo. But we worked together, and I started a special preschool program for children with profound disabilities. There was little to help us in those days, and anything we came across that might help excited us a great deal. So this is about Masako Wally and the vibrator era. In 1982, Masako Wally, now Miyazaki, was head of the occupational therapy program at the University of Alberta and an active researcher in stroke therapy. She told those of us involved in the newly minted GRIT program about a new form of rehabilitation she had discovered that worked well for her stroke clients and might also work for our children. It appeared to trigger regeneration of axons in the central nervous system, a hot topic in the research era of that era. Up to that point, it had been believed that brain cells could not regenerate. She explained that vibration can trigger proprioception, body awareness of force and pressure, which in turn has a dramatic effect on balance. But this only worked with vibrators whose pulsation rate fell within a very narrow range. Masako thought that using this method for our children could improve balance, reduce the intensity of seizures, and in a new variation she had recently discovered, increase lip and tongue control, making mealtime for our children easier and reducing the risk of aspiration. In those days, we had very few ways to help our children, so this was exciting and hopeful information for us. We clamored to know when we could start and where we could acquire these magical vibrators. There was only one place, she told us. When we got there, we needed to speak to the tall man who always wore a three-piece pinstripe suit. We should ask him for the non-doctor vibrator and the therapeutic mouthpiece to go with it. We could mention her name as he was used to dealing with her. The place we needed to visit was simply called the Love Shop. It had newly opened on Jasper Avenue in the heart of downtown Edmonton. The parents looked at me helplessly. One suggested that I go there and purchase a set for each of them, and they could then reimburse me. After all, I was the program developer and coordinator. I refused, wondering how I was even going to get up the nerve to buy my own set, but I did. The tall, thin man was there in his three-piece suit, and he greeted me most graciously and professionally. I acquired the two separate items as quickly as possible, transferred them to the shopping bag from another store that I had brought with me, and after checking outside to make sure nobody I knew was in the vicinity, I slunk out. How did they work? In Alexis' case, at least, they proved to be worth the embarrassment of acquiring them and soon became just another tool in our repertoire. The mouthpiece was particularly effective. It attached firmly to the vibrator, and before every meal, we would run it over Alexis' tongue and all over the inside of her mouth and lips for several minutes. Alexis soon acquired greater control over her tongue than previously and was also able to close her lips more effectively when eating. It was as if her tongue, formerly inert and sloppy in her mouth, came to life, and Alexis seemed delighted with the result, moving it around and all over her mouth, even between meals, apparently just for the fun of it. We took to calling her Mrs. Tongue. The other parents also reported gains with the use of the vibrator, more so in some cases than in others. Brain damage comes in many forms, and the results of this treatment were therefore unpredictable. For one of the children in the program, the vibrator seemed to be particularly effective for increasing balance and reducing seizure severity. And about a year after acquiring the first vibrator, the child's mother, Sandra, found it necessary to make a second trip to the Love Shop. We mothers were in general a motley crew, wrapped up in caring for our children with little time left to consider such peripheral matters as elegance and style. But Sandra always presented herself in a very professional way, both in her dress and in her general mien. She had purchased her initial vibrator from a different place, but this second time she found herself dealing with the tall man. I want to buy a new non-doctor vibrator, she informed Mr. Three-Piece. We wore out the first one. Nobody else in our group had ever witnessed that person looking in any sense discomposed, but this time he was, according to Sandra. Only then did she realize what she had said. She must have lost some of her own poise at that point, too, and I would have enjoyed witnessing that particular exchange. There were other stories, but here is one I will always remember. It happened early in the second program year when we had 9 new members enrolled. They were all required to buy the vibrator sets, but this time I could not just expect them to do so. 3 of the families lived outside of Edmonton. Another mother, a foster parent, was an older lady, and 2 other families were newcomers to Edmonton from different ethnic groups. Meanwhile, Our teachers and therapists wanted to get on with launching the new program for the children, and an important component for the feeding program was missing. This problem was weighing on me as my husband and I planned a brief weekend trip to Vancouver together, where he was speaking at a university conference. We arrived for the conference in the evening and settled into our hotel on Broadway in downtown Vancouver. The next morning, after Joe left to give his conference presentation at the university, I looked out the hotel window only to discover that there was a love shop right across the street. Suddenly, I had an idea. Perhaps I could buy all 8 sets of non-doctor vibrators there if they stocked that many. Then I would not have to worry about anybody I knew seeing me going in or out of the store in Edmonton. But I just could not get up the nerve to go into the love shop alone. When Joe returned from the conference that evening, expecting me to be ready and waiting to go out to dinner, I stated that I wanted to go into the love shop first and check out the vibrators, and I needed him to accompany me. After much complaining, he finally agreed. We entered the shop, and I looked around anxiously for a man in a 3-piece suit. But there was only an overweight young woman there, looking bored and chewing gum. I wandered around timidly until I spied the non-doctor vibrator, but this time it was part of a kit with a therapeutic mouthpiece included. I looked at the price and immediately became excited. The kit was labeled at $29.95. This was $10 less than the 2 pieces together were in Edmonton. "Pardon me," I said to the clerk. She looked at me with raised eyebrows as if I had no right to interrupt her from her placid gum chewing. "Yes," she drawled. "Is the therapeutic mouthpiece included with the vibrator for this price?" I asked, pointing at the $29.95 sticker. "The what?" "The therapeutic mouthpiece," I replied, pointing at it. "That's not a therapeutic mouthpiece," she replied. "That's an anal stimulator." I stood there speechless and in shock, and another couple who had come into the store were now staring at me. Still, I had a responsibility and needed to pull myself together. "But the price," I finally managed to croak out. Is that the price for both pieces?" "Yes," she said, a question in her voice. "I would like 8 sets, if you have them, please." She collected the items, I paid her, and we returned to the hotel. Joe's only comment was, "How do you plan to fit all those into your suitcase?" "I have to phone Debbie," I replied. "Can't it wait until we get home tomorrow?" "No, I need to phone Debbie right now," I replied, and I picked up the phone. Debbie, I said, and she answered. "What?" she replied, concern in her voice. "I bought the vibrators, 8 sets, but you will never guess what we've been putting in our children's mouth." And I told her. "Everybody knew that but you, Emma," was her response. So in that case, I guess the joke was on me. So I'll just say at the end of that Alexis was 4 when the GRIT program finally started, the very day after her 4th birthday in February. And I would also like, so there wasn't that much time left to get all the work done that we had to, because the program was open to people 2.5 and up to 5.5, but of course it took a while to get it going. Second thing I'd like to say is a welcome to Catherine McLeod, who took over sometime after me as the GRIT coordinator and made an incredible difference to this program, which is now vital and thriving almost 40 years later. So welcome, Catherine. Okay, I'm going to move on now to a different kind of story. Alexis at Southgate. One August, when Alexis was 9, I took her shopping for school clothes at what was then the Eaton's department store at our Southgate Mall here in Edmonton. I was particularly looking for some stylish trousers for her, trim-fitting but washable and easy to get on and off. As we headed for the change room with some hopeful finds, I noticed a nurse with medical equipment seated in an alcove. She even had an oxygen tank. And I remembered that Eaton's had many elderly customers who might suddenly require some basic medical assistance. That's handy, I thought. And then placed Alexis on the floor in the change room so she could try on the new pants I had selected. A particularly nice pair I had chosen were elegantly slim in the legs and therefore a little tricky to get on. As I wrestled with them, I could not help but think how ridiculously heavy and inert Alexis' legs had become. She was still quite flexible at that early point in her life and generally responded better when I was dressing her. After struggling away for a couple of minutes, I looked in exasperation at her face, about to say something, and I was completely shocked by what I saw. Her whole face was mottled gray, and her lips were completely black. The pants were half on and half off at that point, and I quickly pulled them off so I could lift her. In the process, one long sock was pulled down to her ankle, and I saw that Alexis' leg was navy blue all the way up to her knee. I then saw that her arms were equally blue up to her elbows. I raced out, calling for the nurse to get her oxygen tank, and she came running. She did her best to handle the situation, holding the face mask firmly against Alexis' mouth and nose and turning on the oxygen, but nothing happened. Alexis' whole face was blue-black at that point. I jerked the mask away and began artificial respiration, forcefully breathing into her mouth as strongly as I could. Not so hard, the nurse warned me, you could rupture her lung. I tempered my efforts, but was gratified to see the color gradually returning to her face, and she was soon able to start breathing on her own. The nurse gently pushed me aside and again administered the oxygen. This time, Alexis was able to breathe it in, and the horrible blue-black color soon disappeared entirely. Alexis fell dead asleep at that point, and I sat on the floor trembling for many minutes before I had the energy to lift her into her cot and leave the store. Alexis' body was so limp, I had to prop her in the trunk support in the car with one hand while I fumbled to secure the straps with the other. Somehow I got her home, although I was shaking so badly that I could hardly drive. Fortunately, Joe was there and met us at the door. He saw the look on my face and Alexis' limp body and quickly took her out of the trunk support and carried her to bed. After telling him what happened, I went to bed myself, drained and exhausted. I slept deeply, but then I dreamed of Alexis with cold black lips trapped inside her own living death. I remembered then what the 3 different neurologists had said about Alexis. Death could happen anytime at all. I'll tell you one final story about Alexis' rehabilitation equipment. We have a lot of it, but one of her favorites is her electric foot bicycle. Many of the rehabilitation devices used for Alexis through the years have only worked for her because her foot and leg alignment has been maintained through the use of the standing frame and daily exercises. The most successful of these has been her electric foot bicycle. Joe built a platform under the foot bicycle to raise it, and by removing her wheelchair foot pieces and tying her feet to the pedals with bungee cords, she has been able to pedal away on it for as long as she wants, while sitting comfortably in her wheelchair. We usually set the timer for 15 minutes. Joe and I remember dearly the first time we fastened her feet into this device and turned it on. The look on her face was priceless. As Joe said at the time, she thinks she's pedaling to Red Deer, a small city 150 kilometers south of Edmonton. She thinks she's doing it herself. The exercise this device provides for Alexis' legs and knees is very important, and I very much regret that we did not know of its existence, if in fact it existed, and acquire it much sooner, when her limbs were still young and relatively supple. We did have a mechanical foot bicycle, but for that to work, her helper needed to get down on her knees and turn the pedals. This activity did not appeal to our assistants for very long, or to me at all. I have bad knees and a short attention span. As good as this device is for Alexis from a physical perspective, I believe it is even more powerful from a psychological one. People as disabled as Alexis are used to having things done to them and for them, but never by them. The sense of self-efficacy she must feel, using her legs without a person leaning over her and moving them, must be powerful. It is noteworthy that she rarely complains when she is pedaling on the bicycle. So those are a few of the excerpts from the new memoir, and I hope you enjoy them.
Amazing, Emma.
Thank you,
I loved your stories.
Are there any questions? Because now would be the time to ask them before I move on to reading from one of the Clairberg books.
Is the book divided into years? Like, does it follow consecutive years?
Not entirely. I tried to keep it chronological, but there are so many different themes that sort of had to be handled together that I couldn't do it, but I tried to make at least it make sense, to sort of record at least what age she was at different times. Thanks, Mary Jo.
Emma,
Yes.
thank you for sharing your stories. They're so touching. I was wondering, over the years, did you write these stories or did you write them more recently? How did you go about compiling them?
Well, it's always an interesting question for a writer, isn't it, Rosetta? And I'm sure you have the same experience with your own writing. I kept some notes, and I would go out to a motel, as I've discussed on other occasions, a motel in Leduc, a Super 8, with my 300 pages of notes and sort of maunder away for a week at a time, trying to figure out what way to go. I did that several times. In terms of writing, I had written bits and pieces earlier on. I'm not sure if I wrote the sled story entirely. A lot of it, no, I didn't really write. I just remembered. And of course, I have others still in my life, people like Kathy and Mary Jo, who experienced part of it, and sometimes would bring something to mind. But when Alexis was diagnosed, the professor I worked with at the university, who was an expert in this field, suggested that I keep a diary, and I never did that, unfortunately. But as I said, I scratched down things from time to time, so I did have something. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Emma,
Yes.
you can explain the final diagnosis for Alexis, which came at the end of the book when you had finished writing the book.
I almost don't want to.
Okay.
Well, we could never understand why Alexis had these shocking seizures where she stopped breathing, because I know a lot of people with epilepsy, but I don't know anybody who has these sustained periods of non-breathing, 30 seconds maybe during a grand mal, but not like minutes, and in some cases up to 20 minutes where she wouldn't breathe on her own. We'd have to keep doing mouth to mouth, and if you stopped, her lips would get dark and you have to start again and so forth. So we did some genetic testing finally. We applied years and years ago, but it was a very delayed process. And nothing came back positive. There were no genetic anomalies that we could tell by what we can do in Alberta here. I was asked, though, because of the peculiarness of her seizures, if we wanted to explore further testing internationally. So Joe and I and Alexis all had our blood taken and sent to a lab in Finland. And on December 22nd of 2020, we got the diagnosis that Alexis had this disorder, CACNA 1E, I believe it's called, which involves an interference with calcium channels going into the brain. And its most telling criterion is a very devastating seizure disorder, very severe. And nobody had lived beyond the age of 25 at that point who had this disorder, and there were only 30 people in the world with it. And one of the reasons that so many of them died was cardiorespiratory failure. So when I heard that, I thought, yeah, I guess that's what we've been dealing with all these years. That's what it is. And you have to be on the ball. You have to be watching. So it was a shock for Joe. Joe was, in a sense, almost relieved. He was glad to know. He can speak for himself if he wishes, but he could see it. There was nothing we could have done different at any point along the way that would have changed him. So it was not within our control. It's just something we needed to live with, and Alexis needed to live with. But I felt like I had to rethink everything. Like, what was the point? Why did we do all that work? Where were we going? What if that was the inevitable end of it all? What was the use of it all? So I struggled with that for a long time. And then I finally came to the point where I realized that, no, we all make choices in life. We all choose for some things and against other things. We all find different ways to find meaning in our life. We got meaning with a vengeance, and we've had a pretty good life. And Alexis has had the best life we could give her. So I guess that's all we can say about that. All right.
Eloise here. Yeah, I'm sort of just reflecting on how or whether it would have been different if you had have had the name of Alexis' condition. Whether, like, my sense is not knowing made it a much more useful and worthwhile struggle. Because sometimes when we name something, we think we know it, and then that's the end of it. So yes, this is her condition, can't do anything. But in the not knowing, you did everything humanly possible to give Alexis a worthwhile life.
You know, I really appreciate your remark, Eloise. It's very perceptive, and I think that's true. I think on reflection, I'm glad we didn't know.
Yeah.
I'm glad we didn't even have her die. She was not diagnosed, until she was 9 months old. We were told at birth that she was okay. So I'm glad we didn't know, because we just learned to love Alexis for who Alexis is. And at that point, well, nothing else was relevant. We just carried on like any parents carry on. We love their children. So you're right. It was in a way better that we never knew. But I'm really glad now when I think back on it, and believe me, it was a very big shock. It was less than a year ago now that I heard. And when I think back on it, I think it was better this way. And I'm glad I know now. I really am glad I understand why these non-breathing spells happen, because they're terrifying. Yeah. Thanks.
Emma,
Yeah.
George here. I'm just wondering, is there any particular writers or books, fiction or nonfiction, that you have found helpful in thinking through and feeling your way through this wonderful and challenging performance of parenting, if I can put it that way.
You're too generous, thank you. Oh, well, writers, okay, I'll tell you something. There are some very good books written by other parents, and there are advocates and there are professionals who have written on this subject, and there's lots of inspiring literature. But when I found out about Alexis, the books that helped me the most were books about loss, and they were books brought to me by a major support person for me, the wife of a Lutheran pastor who happened to be the mother of the girls we had found to babysit for us. She had 3 daughters. And every week she would bring me a different book. And in those days, I was not interested in religion at all, but she was religious and she brought me religious books. And they were all about people who had a gut-wrenching loss and who struggled to come to terms with. And those were the books that I found helpful. So that's your answer.
Emma, I just want to say thank you for sharing your stories. I still remember very fondly and with great humility the time that I met Alexis, and I saw Joe. And you weren't there. You weren't there that when I first arrived. But I saw Joe at first, and then I saw you later. And I have to say that when I think about what I saw and witnessed, it was just the greatest love that one can visualize or experience, that one can be a testimony to, which is what I think I was.
Well, Vincenzo, thank you. Vincenzo Pietropalo has written a wonderful book put together. It's a book of photographs of people with disabilities across the country. He researched this and crisscrossed the country and interviewed people, including us, to make these people visible. And it's an amazing job. And what's more amazing about it is he isn't so much personally touched by this issue. It's just something he took on, and that's not usual. So
I feel greatly humbled that sort of to be able to share and to witness, especially that moment when Joe and Alexis were having supper. That will stay engraved in my mind like a photograph. Thank you, Joe. Awesome.
thank you. Shall I move on
Yes.
now to a reading from the Claire Burke series? This is from book 5 of the 8 that have been published to date. The book 5 is called Murder on Highway 2. And all of the books involve characters with disabilities woven in, but they're also good mystery stories, and they also have other characters. And what I'm reading today, ironically, is mostly about one of those other types of characters. But you will see that the disability issue comes into play as well. I hope those of you in the audience who are literature people will appreciate the literature of this, not the social science of it. Okay. Just let me find it here. I'll just give a second. Yes. Okay, here we go. It was coming straight at them, down the entrance ramp on the right. The huge wall of a tanker loomed on their left. Why was Gary driving so slowly? It was too late now anyway. The big white van was almost upon them, its GMC logo leering at her. Marion's last thought before it hit, before she lost all awareness, was, my poor daughter. Chapter 1, Loss of Life, a New Life. Hilda Boaz hummed as she sauteed fish for supper, her slightly off-key notes covered by the roaring kitchen fan. Her husband should be back from driving her mother to the airport soon. Maybe if we're alone for a while, it will help, she thought. Maybe if we have the chance to talk it through, to really talk it through. We'll get close again. Hilda stopped humming and turned the fan off. Had she heard something? Yes, there it was again, the doorbell. Who comes to the door at supper time? Somebody soliciting for money, no doubt, she muttered to herself. Hilda opened the door and stared in surprise at the two RCMP officers. Mrs. Boaz, Mrs. Thomas Garrett Boaz, your mother is Marion McKay? She nodded mutely. I'm sorry to tell you that we have bad news for you. May we come in, please? A while later, they left, turning with a final plea at the door. Are you sure there's nobody we can call for you? I have a cousin who lives nearby. I'll call him. He'll want to know. But she didn't call. Bill wouldn't understand if she did, and he certainly couldn't help. He'd have his own loss to deal with when Claire finally explained it to him, and she'd have to be the one. Hilda and her autistic cousin were not close. They didn't even like each other. Hilda sat down in her favorite living room chair, a half-cooked fish forgotten on the cooling stove burner. She felt numb, shocked, she thought. Staring around the room, she suddenly realized, it's my room, my house now. Her accountant's mind, so long attuned to adding up pluses and minuses, did a quick mental calculation of the financial implications of this sudden change of circumstance. Gary and she each had hefty life insurance policies. He'd insisted on that. And then there were Marion's assets. Hilda knew she was the chief beneficiary, although she'd never actually seen the will. Marion had been rather secretive about that. Hilda got up with the intention of going to Marion's room to find the will. But then she collapsed back in her chair, and the tears came for the first time, and they came hard. After several minutes, she recovered enough to think. She was alone. There was nobody left to care about her. And her poor mother had died an awful death. What had the officer said? That death had been instantaneous, that they couldn't have suffered? But there had to be those moments before. The horror of the inevitable, that van bearing down on them and nowhere to go, no escape. Hilda scanned the room again. There on top of the buffet was their bottle of modestly priced scotch, the source of their nightly drink. And beside it sat the expensive cognac, saved for important guests, of whom they had few, and meted out sparingly by her husband. How many years had they had that bottle? Hilda wondered. She grabbed it along with one of the 3 expensive brandy snifters they owned and returned to her seat. Hilda slopped a generous amount of brandy into her glass, some spilling down the side and onto the table. She laughed harshly, swiped it up with her hand, and wiped her hand down her dress. How Gary would have hated that, she thought. The waste and the impropriety. But most of all, the waste. Hilda continued to drink and ruminate well into the night, with each swallow reminding her of all they'd passed up in their endless and single-minded quest for money. She'd gone along with him on that, she had to admit. It had been her father's obsession too, but not Marion's. She tried not to think of her mother, because every time she did, she was assaulted by an unbearable onslaught of pain. No, she mustn't think of her. What about the money? Where was she at now? As the night progressed, Hilda's thoughts turned more and more to her husband, and the anger grew. He'd never liked Marion, and he hadn't wanted her to live with him. Marion threatened everything he believed in. Hilda knew that, and it was worse since Claire had started the group home. Marion had talked endlessly of the challenges and the successes for the 3 young adults who lived there in the house across the street from Claire's close friend Tia and Tia's new husband Jimmy and Tia's precocious 10-year-old son Mario. Hilda thought about them, including her cousin Bill. He'd been very close to Marion in his own way, and soon he'd have to know what happened. She would call Claire tomorrow. Claire and Tia might not care about her, but they certainly cared about Marion and Bill. Marion had been part of their little group from the beginning, but Hilda had only been on the edge, partly her own choice and partly her husband's resistance. What was the point of all this fussing over them, he asked? It should be enough that they had a roof over their heads and food in their bellies. And once he'd even gone so far as to say that it was too bad they'd lived, particularly Jimmy's sister, Mavis, who was nonverbal and quadriplegic. What could she possibly get out of that? But it wasn't all as pointless as Gary claimed. Hilda herself had seen the games. She remembered Roscoe at Tia's wedding, how dignified he was to them during their first meal at his restaurant before it had officially opened. And what about Bill? According to Marion, he'd been doing well in his sous chef job in the restaurant and becoming quite adept with a pairing knife. Who would have thought, she asked herself. And then there was Mavis, Jimmy's sister. Gary was right there to some extent, Hilda thought. That really was a sad case. But she admired Tia and Jimmy for trying so hard to make a life for Mavis. Like Claire with her daughter Jessie, Hilda thought, though she was not convinced that either Jessie or Mavis was aware enough to even appreciate all the effort being expended on them. But Marion, poor Marion, she'd been worried about Bill for so long, ever since she brought him up to Edmonton, she moved here. As his legal guardian, Marion had felt solely responsible for him. True, Jimmy had taken on co-guardianship when Hilda refused, but Marion had regarded that as just a technicality and continued to shoulder the burden alone. And now that things were finally looking so good for Bill, Marion had thought she could take a trip back to Scotland to see the land where her parents grew up and connect with some cousins there. After a lifetime, she was finally going. And look what happened. Hilda wept again, and this time she couldn't stop. She dragged herself from her chair and stumbled off to bed. It was already 3:30 in the morning. The bottle of cognac that had been 3/4 full that afternoon was now 3/4 empty, and it sat forlornly on the side table next to her chair. All right, that's it. That's all my readings for today. So I don't know if there are any final comments or not.
Emma, it's Barb.
Yes. Hello, Barb.
I want to know how you bottle up all of this energy, the such inspiring stories, the memories of Alexis in your early family years, but then these other stories, and you do all of this with such grace. And I've just always been so impressed by your interests and expanded creativity in so many areas. So it's just been an honor to listen to you today.
You're too kind, Barb, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the admiration goes both ways. Barb is the current director of the GRIT program and has taken it in places I never thought it would go. It's almost 40 years now that it's been running, right, Barb? And I have no idea how many children it's helped, but I would say over 1,000 through the years, if you add them all up. What would you say?
Well, I remember reading your first story of different hopes and dreams when I was 20 years old in the dentist chair, of all places. But it is our 40th anniversary this year, and we're striving to get 40 stories. So I will borrow and steal another one of yours.
Okay, thank you. Are you there, Maria Pia?
Yes, there are several comments in the chat. Thank you for sharing these wonderful stories from Liana Cusmano, Catherine McLeod. So interesting, great stories.
Well, just to comment, Emma, in that because you couldn't do what you had originally set out to do career-wise, this may have been a way to channel all of that energy and creativity in these other years of your life, saved up, stored, and now it's all coming out in all these writings.
Well, I put in a slightly different spin on it. I really think of Alexis as my business partner. I'm quite sincere about that. And I told her when she was born, and I knew then there was something wrong, even if it took the doctors 9 months to figure it out. I said, we'll get through this together, Alexis. We'll be partners. And in an eerie sort of way, we have been partners. And I would say that it's Alexis who has freed whatever it was in me to offer. And I don't think it would have come out as effectively or well without Alexis. So that's what I get from this. So I don't think in that sense, yes, I made a very different choice considering my PhD dissertation is on giftedness and creativity theory. Obviously, this was ironically very different. But when I think, and the life I planned was very different. But when I think back, I've had many rich experiences, both professionally and in my life with Alexis. And I wouldn't change. I'm sorry for Alexis. We're all sorry for how much she has suffered. But even Alexis has her moments of being happy and content. We spend Saturday evenings with her, sitting in front of the television on a love seat, the three of us together, and watching musicals on the television. We've watched Lady Gaga and Johnny Cash and Bruce Springsteen and a whole host of different people. And she really responds to the music, and that is such a joy to see her respond with our oblique communication methods, because we have no real way of communicating directly. We just have to figure it out. So that's what our life is. So it ain't all bad, by no means. So thank you for asking that. Okay. Anything else from anybody?
There are 2 other comments. Barb says, bravo, indeed, so much passion, compassion, and creative energy. Rosanna writes, Emma, your fiction is as captivating as your nonfiction. Your writing is as strong, as wonderful as you are.
You guys are over the top. Thank you. Anyway, I've enjoyed being able to participate today and have this opportunity to speak to you all. And the book, if anyone is interested, is available. And what I would say to you, if you phone your bookstore and it isn't there, ask them to order it in, because they should. And that's the only way we'll keep our local bookstores going. And it's the only way any author gets to get their books read. Because writing is a tough slog these days. Nobody reads anymore, it seems like. So appreciate all your support. Thank you. Thank you to all of you.
And I'm going to thank you, anyone, for joining us today. Thank you. And have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.